We are back on Taking Care of Business on Koerner Radio, News Talk, 1180, 1230, KGEO, 1410 KERI, and now in Albuquerque, New Mexico on 1000 KKIM, and in the Richmond, San Francisco, Oakland Bay area.
You know, if we get too many more stations, we're not going to be able to list them all.
I know. We're just going to have to say numerous stations.
Numerous,
as opposed to more than a couple.
A few.
Yes.
Some.
So, our guest by phone, Henry Bushkin, former attorney for Johnny Carson.
And author.
An author of a great new book I highly, highly recommend. I'm in the middle of it right now, called Johnny Carson. So, Henry, a couple questions for you about Johnny Carson, the man. Just the feeling I'm getting from the book, was he a lonely individual? Which you wouldn't think looking at him on his show, but was he lonely? Was he happy?
He would describe himself as basically unhappy. There was an article in Life magazine in early 1970, shortly before I actually met him, where he described himself as an unhappy person. When I first was introduced to him by his manager, he described him as the second unhappiest person he's ever met, the first being Jack Benny.
Wow.
So I would say his personality was basically unhappy. That's not to mean he couldn't be hilariously funny, and he could roast a room and take over if he wanted to, but generally he didn't. So he could be brilliant, or he could be unto himself.
Well, a couple times in the book you've alluded to his relationship with his mom. I guess his mom was pretty tough on him.
She was from the Midwest, and I would describe her as Midwestern Gothic, stern, lacking in emotion, lacking in warmth. She wasn't able to pass that on to her son, and he wasn't really able to pass that on to others. He really suffered by it. Those of us who knew him well knew this. He knew it, and it was the complexity that resulted from the lack of warmth from his mom.
And he didn't have much of a relationship with his children as well.
Same thing. He loved his children. There's no question about that. He just never figured out quite how to be a good dad.
Now, how many children were there?
3.
And where are they today, do you know?
One died the middle son, Rick, died in 1991, and the youngest son, I believe, is in Hawaii. I think he's a musician, and the oldest son, I believe, is still a golf pro in Miami.
Now, he also had, I think, was it 3 wives?
4.
4 wives. Were they all named Joan?
The first one was Joan, the second one was Joanne, and the third one was Joanna. So they kept adding a letter at the end of each, and it sort of worked, and then the fourth one, her name started with an A.
An A.
An A.
So do you think because of his personality and his failure of warmth, this was part of his problem with his spouses?
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. I think the spouse reaches the point where she tries and tries and tries, to get something out of him, and then he doesn't have anything to give, and then probably they give up. I'm not a psychiatrist, but in writing the work, that's sort of what I came to conclude, that this was inevitable.
I guess he had a pretty hefty alimony payments.
He could afford it.
It's a good thing with 4 X's.
Yeah.
Well, he died worth $500 million, so I think he could afford it.
Yeah.
Speaking of wives, there's another great transition you're making for me. According to your book, one of your first assignments was to break into his wife's apartment. Can you tell that story? Tell us a little bit about that.
That's when I got hired to accompany him on this break-in and be there in case the cops came. Fortunately, the cops never came. Fortunately, we got into the apartment, obtained whatever evidence we needed, and subsequent to that, a divorce action was filed. So, yeah, that was my first assignment, 2 days on the job, or really 2 days into meeting him. It was my first day on the job, and it was a harrowing experience then, and I hope it comes across as sort of humorous today, because it was meant to show the sort of the Keystone Cops type of nature of the relationship as it began. It was sort of amusing
Yeah.
43 years later.
Well, it's a great story, and obviously she was having an affair, and the idea was to go in the apartment and prove it. And I guess the gentleman she was having an affair with was Frank Gifford.
I could only speak to what I found in the apartment. That's all.
Okay.
Other than that, I couldn't tell you anything of their relationship.
Okay, but you did find clothes, men's clothes, in the apartment, and they were Frank Gifford's.
Yeah,
Beyond that,
let's put it this way: we certainly found enough evidence to prove a case of adultery, which was required in New York in those days.
Sure. Our guest.
So that was really necessary. It was an awful experience then. I hope today it's looked sort of with a comedic sense, because I intended it to be.
It did in the book.
I think it's funny today. I think it was harrowing then, funny today.
Yeah, it is funny today.
It'd be a different outcome today, however.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't think I'd be doing it today.
No.
Our guest by phone, Henry Bushkin, Johnny Carson's attorney, who wrote a great new book I highly recommend, Johnny Carson.
Henry, was this your only position, or were you still practicing law and representing other clients at the time?
Well, I was representing a lot of people, but the reality was that other lawyers in the firm were taking care of them, because my time was almost exclusively devoted to Johnny or his business interests. So, I had, when I left, when Johnny and I terminated, I didn't have any clients, because they were all given to other lawyers during the time that the firm was in existence. So when I was through with Johnny, I didn't have any clients, to be perfectly honest.
So when you were with him, you were probably closer to him than any of his spouses or even his kids.
I think that's a fair conclusion.
And you were with him for how many years?
18.
18 years. And after you left him, then of course you had to go back and build up a practice.
Sure.
Or write books, I guess.
Well, no. Look, the book started in 2008, and that's 30 years after our relationship was over.
Wow.
So come on, it's not like this was first thing on my mind. This was presented to me by Ed Hookstratton. He was the lawyer who followed me in representing Carson. He was the guy who shut down all the companies. And he said to me, "Why don't you write that book? Everybody would like to know about the guy." So that's how I started writing the book. It had nothing to do with me practicing law after I left Johnny. It was never my intent then to write a book.
I think there was an interesting story about where he was trying to buy a lot from his neighbor, and for some reason the neighbor wouldn't sell it, so he dug a tunnel under the neighbor's property and built a tennis court on the other side. Is there any truth to that?
No. It's slightly skewed, the story. There was a neighbor in Malibu who complained to the Coastal Commission about some things that Johnny was doing at his home, which got the Coastal Commission to get him to stop. They issued a stop work order. The penalty in those days was $10,000 a day, by the way. So he stopped whatever he was doing, and he got so pissed at the neighbor that he put the house for sale and sold it to John McEnroe. Okay. Simply because he hated the neighbor, and then bought the home up the road a piece that he was in when he passed away.
Wow. Henry, something else you mentioned in the book that I thought was fascinating is that you tried to keep him out of the mob, and there was a mob hit out on Johnny Carson at one time. Can you tell that story?
Yes, that occurred when he and Ed were drinking one night at Jilly's, when Johnny attempted to pick up the wrong. Actually, there were two girls there, and it was the wife and sister of a well-known mob guy in New York. The wife slugged Johnny, and the owner spirited Johnny and Ed out, and the husband came, and then there was this, I'll put in quotes, a hit out on Johnny. He hid out at home for 3 days, and 3 days later, NBC agreed to broadcast a Columbus Day event that no network would do, and that resulted in the hit being called off, and Johnny went back to work. That story, I wasn't representing. That was slightly before my time, but I could assure you that one of the ladies in that bar is still very much around today. And it's sort of an interesting story. But again, that was maybe 45 years ago.
Wow. Well, we've got a little over a minute left. Again, I highly recommend this book. What was his relationship like with Joan Rivers? At first, I think he was thinking Joan Rivers would be the person that would replace him, and then she got her own show, and then that killed the relationship. Is that what happened? Or
no, she was never intended to replace him. She was always the permanent guest host. That she was brilliant, operating that show 1 week at a time. But more than 1 week at a time, Johnny felt would never work. So when she took her show on Fox in competition with him, had she said to him, "Johnny, I got to take this opportunity. It's a great opportunity for me," he would have said, "God bless, take it, and we'll see what happens." Her show failed almost immediately, right? But she never told him beforehand, and she never told me, or her husband never told me that she was doing this. It was a complete surprise. Johnny was totally aggravated with her and never spoke to her again.
Yeah, it's a shame. Henry, I highly, highly recommend this book. I appreciate you taking the time.
What's the name of the book?
The name of the book is Johnny Carson by Henry Bushkin. Henry, thank you for the time.
Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment on Taking Care of Business on Koerner Radio News Talk 1180.